It began like any ordinary morning, until it didn't. A black woman strolled into the federal courthouse, composed and confident, utterly unaware that those sworn to protect her rights were about to violate them instead. They treated her like a nobody, humiliating her, degrading her, laughing as they overstepped every boundary. What they didn't know was that they had just brutalized the one person with the legal authority to hold them accountable. What followed was a whirlwind of exposure, justice, and a courtroom twist that upended everything. Just after 8:00 a.m., Celeste Monroe stepped out of her silver Buick and ascended the courthouse's stone steps. The low sun filtered through Spanish moss-laden oaks, casting long, ghostly shadows. She straightened the collar of her navy blazer, squared her shoulders, and gripped a slim leather portfolio. Her heels tapped a steady rhythm on the pavement, a silent proclamation of purpose. She never wore her robe until she reached the bench. Outside the courtroom, she preferred to move unnoticed, blending in like any other visitor. But that morning, nothing about her arrival was ordinary. At the security checkpoint, Deputy Riker, an old-school court bailiff notorious for his inflexible manner, sized her up with suspicion. Cross-armed and gloved, he held up his hand. "Ma'am," he growled, eyes narrowing, "step out of line." "Is there a problem, officer?" Celeste asked, her voice steady. He said nothing, letting his gaze travel from her silver-cropped hair to her tailored slacks, lingering on the calm in her eyes. An unsettling confidence for someone he assumed was just another trespasser. "No ID," he muttered under his breath. Celeste produced her federal badge. The metal caught the light, but Riker only glanced at it before tucking it into his pocket as if it meant nothing. "I'd like that back," she said, arching an eyebrow. "Relax, sweetheart," he sneered, stepping closer. "You're in a hurry, right? We're doing a random check." Before she could protest, he seized her arm and steered her toward a secluded, windowless screening room. Inside, the air was still and cold. A lone steel chair sat in the center, flanked by an array of security gadgets and a pair of hair clippers. Celeste's heart hammered. "I don't consent to this," she said. "You have no legal basis. You're detaining me without cause." "That's cause enough," he replied, motioning to the chair. "Sit." She stood her ground. He leaned in. "That badge you flashed doesn't mean a thing here." Almost immediately, 2 more officers joined them. One gripped her left wrist, the other held the chair. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Clippers buzzed. Riker smiled. "You could be hiding something in that mop." Before she could react, the clippers pressed to her scalp. Thick coils of silver hair fell in rings to the tile floor. She felt the vibration against her scalp, the slow loss of something that had taken years to grow. Yet she didn't cry out. She didn't plead. She sat, dignity intact, as piece after piece of her hair was stripped away. When it finally stopped, Riker wiped loose strands from his sleeve and mocked, "Much better. Now you look presentable." Celeste sat motionless, fists clenched. Then, in a voice as calm as she'd started, she said, "You'll regret this." He laughed. "People like you always say that." He opened the door. "You're free to go. Courtroom's that way." She rose, reclaimed her badge without asking, and walked back into the hall. Every step echoed with suppressed fury, but also with purpose. Soon that purpose would transform the entire courtroom. She pushed open the heavy double doors and entered the courtroom. Instantly, the murmur of conversation cut off, eyes lifting in collective surprise. The same polished marble floor that had felt oppressive on her uneven steps now seemed to hum beneath her resolute stride. Lawyers, journalists, plaintiffs, and defendants all froze, mid-sentence, mid-note, as they registered the woman who had just been dragged into that corridor like a criminal. And then the realization rippled. This was the very judge they'd expected to see only in her robes until this morning, when she'd been treated as a suspect. Celeste slipped behind the bench and turned deliberately to face the assembled courtroom. Her expression was composed, almost austere, an unflinching calm that spoke of focus rather than peace. The empty judge's chair loomed behind her, but she didn't pause. Instead, she reached over, unfolded her robe from the arm of the chair, and donned it in one unhurried motion, letting its weight settle across her shoulders like armor. Then she spoke, voice steady. "Is the docket ready?" The clerk's reply quavered, but it came. "Yes, Your Honor." Celeste nodded once, lowered herself into the chair, and looked straight ahead, never once meeting the eyes of the officers at the defense table. We will begin with preliminary testimony in Case 2371F, United States versus the Charleston Police Department. Charges of abuse of power, excessive force, and civil rights violations. All parties present? A chorus of "Yes, Your Honor" echoed off the walls. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle in every corner of the room. The first witness, a patrol officer from last year's protest, took the stand. He had been seen on camera pushing an elderly veteran to the ground, fracturing ribs during a peaceful demonstration. Celeste listened without interruption, her pen gliding across her notepad as she observed every hesitation, every change in his posture. From the corner of her eye, she saw Deputy Riker shrink toward the back row, his belt hands twitching as though he expected a summons. He was right. His reckoning was coming. After 2 testimonies, she called a recess. The courtroom emptied quickly, whispers trailing behind departing lawyers. Only her clerk, 2 marshals, and Riker remained. Celeste looked up at him, voice as sharp as glass. "Deputy Riker." He froze. "Step forward." Fumbling, he obeyed, dragging his feet into the silent center. "State your full name for the record." "Hank Riker," he stammered. "And your position here?" "Bailiff. 14 years, Your Honor." She tapped her pen twice against her pad. "In those 14 years, how many formal complaints have been filed against you for misconduct in that screening room?" He began. "Answer." Her tone left no room for evasion. 12, he whispered. "And how many of those were acted upon?" Riker's face went pale. "None," he admitted. She leaned forward. "You thought you could humiliate a federal judge without consequence. You thought I was just another black woman. You thought you'd hide behind procedure and no one would notice." She allowed a beat for the insult to land. "But today, you are the one under criminal investigation." The marshals stepped in and placed him in handcuffs. He shouted, "You can't do this!" But his protest died as they led him away. The courtroom doors swung closed behind him, leaving the bench eerily silent. Celeste sat back, fingers steepled, robe draped like steel around her. The day was far from over, and the real reckoning had only just begun. Megan, one of the quiet interns who'd witnessed the morning's events from the lobby, slipped into the nearly empty courtroom. Her glasses were fogged, and she looked shaken. Celeste folded her hands on the bench and studied the young woman's trembling fingers. I saw everything," Megan finally whispered. "I should have spoken up before, but I was scared. If you need me to testify, I will." Celeste's stern facade softened for the first time that morning. She leaned forward, voice low but firm. "Thank you. Speaking now matters more than silence ever did." When the court reconvened, the mood had shifted palpably. Reporters exchanged whispers, attorneys straightened their ties, and the gallery sat taller. The next witness, Howard Briggs, a salt-and-pepper-bearded warehouse foreman, took the stand. His 17-year-old son had been crushed under an officer's knee at last year's protest. Briggs's voice quavered as he recounted pleading for medical help, only to be told the boy was faking. Celeste listened, pen poised. She asked no questions until he finished. Then gently, "Mr. Briggs, thank you for your courage. Your son has been heard." He nodded, tears brimming. After a brief recess, Celeste retreated to her chambers. She sat before the mirror above the wash basin, fingers trailing absently over the uneven patches on her scalp. The scars of the morning's assault once symbols of humiliation, now felt like battle wounds, proof that she would not be silenced. Before she could gather her thoughts, her clerk knocked. In swept Denise Talley, former records supervisor, her eyes fierce. Denise laid out file after file, 12 buried complaints against Riker, signatures suppressed by higher-ups. Judge Mahoney himself signed off on every dismissal, Denise said, voice shaking with anger. Celeste's jaw tightened. Back in the courtroom, word of these revelations had spread. The seats filled with civil rights advocates, law students, and reporters from national outlets. Celeste entered to hushed applause. No fanfare, only recognition of what she represented now. She seated herself behind the bench and formally entered the suppressed complaint folder into evidence, forbidding any defense objection. Late in the afternoon, U.S. Marshal Andrew Taylor, a black officer who'd served alongside Riker years ago, testified that he, too, had seen and tried to report Riker's misconduct, only to have his memo vanish. "I left this courthouse in 2012, Marshal Taylor said, voice heavy with regret, because I couldn't bear the silence anymore." As the rain battered the courthouse windows that evening, Celeste sat alone in her chambers, the confidential records spread before her. One memo stood out, a direct instruction from Judge Mahoney praising Riker's rough but effective methods. The betrayal stung, but it also steeled her resolve. The next morning, the steps before the courthouse were overflowing. Protesters joined by community leaders, all wielding signs reading, "Justice begins now." Inside, Celeste reopened the hearing, turned to the defense, and refused to recuse herself despite claims of bias. She reminded them that true bias was Riker's clippers at her scalp, not her sitting the bench. By midday, the gallery erupted in spontaneous testimony. Dozens of men and women, former clients, witnesses, clerks, stood one by one to share stories of Riker's abuses. There were no whimpers, only shared resolve. Celeste remained silent, letting each voice reinforce the cracks in the system. When closing arguments began, she surprised everyone by removing her robe and standing at the front of the bench. "I have stayed silent too long," she said. As the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, Celeste lingered. Later that night, in the quiet of her chambers, her sister Nadine gently finished shaving away the last uneven patches of hair. This time as an act of choice, not violence. Gazing at her reflection, Celeste saw not wounds, but the face of someone unafraid to reshape the course of justice itself. And so, with her head held high and her purpose renewed, Judge Celeste Monroe stepped back into the world she'd transformed. Proof that dignity, once stripped away, can be reclaimed and wielded as the sharpest instrument of change. The weeks that followed felt almost surreal. The courtroom where Celeste Monroe had once felt most exposed now resonated with something altogether different. Purpose. The uneven patches of her scalp were slowly filling in, each new curl a testament to survival. Yet her days were no less busy. Routine dockets gave way to motions, briefs, and sentence hearings. But beneath the ordinary churn lay something extraordinary, a subtle but palpable shift in every room she entered. One afternoon, an invitation brought her into a local middle school classroom. Expecting a handful of students and polite questions, she instead found itself packed. Desks pushed aside, walls plastered with signs that read, "Be like Judge Monroe," and "Justice for all." When she introduced herself, the room burst into applause. Hands shot up, young voices asking everything she'd already lived. How did you stay so calm? Did you ever want to quit? What was it like to lose your hair? Celeste answered each one with honesty. The fear, the resolve, the moment she realized she could not remain silent. A shy girl in the back, her voice barely above a whisper, asked, "Do you still believe in the system?" Celeste paused. "I don't believe in what the system was," she said. but I believe in what it can become, and in people like you who won't let it stay broken." That evening, tears of hope streamed down her face as she drove home. For the first time in months, they were tears of promise rather than pain. Before long, word of her reforms, the Monroe Mandate, had spread beyond Charleston. Other judges called, seeking guidance on implementing anti-bias training, psychological evaluations, and zero-tolerance policies. State legislators drafted bills inspired by her example, and then came a call from Washington. The White House requested her presence at the Presidential Medal of Justice ceremony. Standing backstage beneath grand drapes and chandeliers, Celeste waited as dignitaries and former opponents took their seats. When her name was announced, the hall rose, applause rolling like thunder. At the podium, she looked out over the sea of faces. Her sister seated proudly in the front row, the young intern Megan, now a first-year law student, Reverend Hill, and the quiet girl from that classroom. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she began, voice steady. "Not because I didn't deserve it, but because systems like this have never been built for people like me. When I finally reached this bench, I was reminded that I didn't belong. Yet I stayed, I stood, and I made them see me." A single flashbulb illuminated her smile. "This medal isn't just mine. It belongs to every woman told to stay silent, every person told justice wasn't for them, every child who looked at the law and saw only fear. This is for you." Her words hung in the hushed auditorium, followed by a standing ovation too deep for cheers. Back in Charleston, in the very courthouse where it all began, the marble halls no longer felt cold. Interns walked with their heads high. The janitor offered her a knowing nod. Courtroom doors opened automatically for her now, as though the building itself recognized the change. Months later, Celeste Monroe returned to that same middle school classroom, this time as a guest of honor at the annual civics fair. The students greeted her with handmade cards and essays on justice. One sign still hung above the chalkboard, "Be like Judge Monroe." On her way out, Celeste paused in the hallway. Sunlight streamed through a window, illuminating the dust motes in the air like floating stars. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Justice, she'd learned, was not a destination, but a process. One begun by refusing to be invisible. In her chambers that evening, she peeled off her robe and hung it carefully behind her desk. The scars on her scalp had nearly vanished. The new growth was thick and even. Celeste touched her hair, remembering each indignity and each moment of resolve. There would always be more cases to hear, more injustices to correct. But she knew this now. Every time she took her seat, she carried with her not just the weight of the law, but the strength of every voice that had finally been heard. And that, she thought as she switched off the lights, was where true justice begins, within each of us, spoken out loud.